and hopefully I will be able to put it up tomorrow. We've got quite a few guests in tonight. Hi, Ian. Okay, we're into the fourth session. Actually, it's the fifth one actually, but fourth when it comes to the knowledge areas. And what we're going to be doing tonight is managing project cost. So we're going to be looking at that. Mostly tonight we'll be looking at the techniques to manage that cost. So tonight's session is really got to do with costs, and let's look at the costs. Now the costs are going to come in two areas. The processes in those two areas is in planning and then in monitoring. So the first two is cost estimating, cost budgeting, which is planning, and then in the process group, and then we have cost control, which is monitoring and controlling those costs. So we're going to look at some of those techniques to actually do it. How do we go about cost estimating, budgeting, and control? So that's what we're doing tonight. And the first things that I want to talk about is to determine the project costs. The questions that a project sponsor will ask, or a higher authority may ask when considering a project proposal, may include some of the following. It is essential that these processes and tools that you use to determine the project costs are able to answer these questions. Okay, so here are our questions. The first one being, what is the estimated budget for the project? So there needs to be an estimated budget for the project. Now, they're all different kinds of costs, and so we will look at some of those tonight, but the essence is, what is this going to cost me? If we do this project, what is it going to cost? So we need to be able to estimate that. We're going to look at some of the ways to estimate it. And then the second question that's going to come up is, how was the estimate determined? How did you determine that estimate? Who determined the estimate? What is the confidence level in the accuracy of this estimate? So you've got to have some sort of confidence in the estimate. And the project sponsors are more than likely going to ask you, well, how did you get there? We're going to look at some of those techniques. It's not easy to determine some of the costing of some projects. And that's a risk area which we'll be looking at soon. But let's look at the project costing. And you've got to have some confidence in the estimate that you've actually provided. Does the budget allow for contingent funding? Under what circumstances can it be accessed? Now, this is a little bit like governance, right? If we're going to have a budget, from a risk perspective, you're going to try, depending on the how risky the project is, you may have contingency. Well, there should always be a contingency fund, but depending how high the risk is, there may be a bigger proportion of that fund. And what you're going to look at then is at cutoff points. So if the budget goes off course, that this one is going to cost more than what expected, then we can use some of the contingency funding. If it goes bigger, then obviously then there's going to be a determination, well, this is no longer a viable proposition anymore. That's because some projects are difficult to budget for. What are the drawdown procedures, okay, for doing that? In other words, and this is where milestones come in to a large extent. What you're going to say, well, as I got to this milestone, therefore I can draw down some more money or for spending on the budget. So what are those drawdown procedures? How he's going to ask you, how are those? He might actually, or she, the project sponsor may actually determine exactly how you're going to draw them down. And some projects are going to actually have multiple ways of actually looking at these things. Might be different ways of actually looking at it, and we'll look at that as we go through tonight. Now the next one is have all projects costs been captured? He or she is going to ask you, have all the project costs been captured? For sure, project sponsor is going to say to you, and look at it very closely to make sure that you have captured all those costs. And then he or she or the project sponsor is going to look at the control measures. What are the reporting measures that need to be followed? What kind of reporting are you going to be doing, and how are you going to do it? So that's an important issue to look at. And what type of contracts will be used to manage those costs? What type of contracts? I know this is getting into project procurement, but all these knowledge areas actually interface with each other, and they all are going to have a problem. Debbie, I think you're going to have a problem with a lot of echo tonight. I see you've come in twice. If you can hear me, I think it might be better to go out a little bit and come back in again. Shut it down. There we go. That's going to be better. If you've done that, that'll be better. And then the next one, what deposits or progress payments may be made? What deposits or progress payments may be made? There will be a way of determining how that is. Sometimes the budget is put out in total, and then you just, especially on smaller projects. In other cases, there's going to be over financial years. The project might be a 2-year project, or might be even a 3-year project. And then what you're going to do is have financial year ends over these projects. Look at that. Good evening, Doug. It's good to see you. What we've been doing up to now is, and maybe I'll go back quickly. We just looked at some of the questions a project sponsor or a higher authority may ask when considering a project proposal. And we've just been through these ones about estimating. So we're busy with estimating tonight. Andrew says I'm dropping out on audio, so it's not very good. I just want to check a couple of things before I go on, please. Just want to check that everything's on. It's on. Okay. No volume, that's okay. All right. I hope it's going to be all right. That's why we're dropping out. I might just drop out for a second. There's no visual. Just 1 second. Can I ask you a favor, please? Doug has come on, but he says there's no visual. Is it possible for you to just give him a call? Can you just see how he went in there or something? Just ask Victoria then. Doug, we're going to try and see why you don't have visual. There shouldn't be any problem. If you've done it correctly, there shouldn't be a problem with visual. Audio is a different matter, and I just want to know if I'm coming across more clearly now. All right, and I'm going to go on. Much better now. Okay, yes. Okay. All right, determining your project costs, and now we're going to look at some estimating. Doug, I've got Victoria's going to give you a call to see what the issue could be. Okay. Now let's look at it. As with time estimates, one of the most important tools that we're going to be using is the work breakdown structure. Work breakdown structure is a very, very important tool for estimating both the time and the costs. Remember, it's the two things that we're going to look at, and I'm going to just put that up quickly. What I want to do is just put an overlay on quickly, and if you can remember, we drew a triangle, and a project manager needs to look at all of those three areas. So if we have deliverables, we've got to deliver something. All right. If we're going to deliver something, then we're going to need the two things that a project manager's got to look at is the time and the cost. Those are the two things that we need to look at. Okay, the time and the cost. Two very, very important things. Now, last week we looked at the time, and this week we're looking at cost. And strangely enough, these two things need very similar processes. So the work breakdown structure is the key tool and technique to find those. Right? So the cost estimating process develops a cost estimate for the resource for both the human and the material. Right? So we're looking at labor cost and we're looking at material cost. And we put those two together to get a project baseline cost. So required for the schedule activity, and we're going to put it for every single activity. A good project manager is going to do it for every activity. Then cost estimates include all the costs of the project over its entire life cycle. So what we want to do is remember that even in the initiating phase, we're going to get costs that are associated with the project. We might even get some costs up front before we've even got a mandate to continue with the project, never mind just the planning. But the cost estimates are going to, and then it's going to be iterative, isn't it? Because you're not going to know the exact costs when you're doing the first part of the thing. And in initiating a project, you're not going to know those initial costs. You're going to have a vague way, and your technique of finding that cost might be very broad. But when we get down to the detailed planning, it's going to get much narrower, and we're going to expect to get a much better cost and a better costing for that. All right, so let's look at the process for this. What are the inputs? What are the tools and techniques we're going to use for estimating, and what are the outputs? Now let's just look at those three things. That's what we're going to be looking at tonight. Is the inputs, the enterprise environmental factors, the organizational process assets. You remember what those are? Anybody give me an idea what those two things are? I know I'm going to ask you over and over again. We're going to see a little bit more about those tonight as we go through them. But they are two important things from the PMI. Strange words that we will see, but that's what it means. And then it's obviously the project scope statement. What is the scope to make sure that we are budgeting and taking the whole scope into consideration? We're going to look at the work breakdown structure, and we're going to look at the detail of each of those activities by understanding what the dictionary is. And then obviously the project management plan is now an accumulation of the specifications and everything else that go with that. So here are some of the tools and techniques. The Ageless estimating, and then we have the determine the resource cost rates. We have bottom-up estimating, parametric estimating, fixed budget estimating, project management software, which we're not going to talk too much about. It does a lot of costing, helps with the costing. The vendor bid analysis, and then we have reserve analysis and cost of the quality. And then really what we're trying to get out of here are the activity cost estimating. So we want to get back that every activity is costed. And then we need supporting detail for that. Then we're going to say, well, what happens when we change? Remember, either time is going to change or cost is going to change. So those are the two changeable variables that we have in a project. We need to know how we're going to manage that. Right, let's go on to the next one. Any questions? Let's look at the inputs now. Okay, now, if we look at the standards and the environmental factors, it's really the standards and the regulations, the industry and government. It's going to be your company culture, skills and your knowledge of existing and your existing personnel. It's the risk tolerance of stakeholders, and it's the project information system. Your project information system. So that's what we mean by the environmental factors, and this I think is the first time I've actually put it up that you can actually see it. Those are the things that we talk about when we talk about environmental factors. And then the second thing which will help clarify tonight is actually the organizational process assets. And here we've got some of them. Those are the templates, the project descriptions, the organizational charts, the performance appraisals, conflict management process, and it's also checklists. All right. So all of those things that you probably have in your quality manual, or in your vision statement, or in your templates that you have in there, or your standards and all your standards there, your project roles and responsibility, the skills and competency levels, safety issues, all of those would be part of the input. Then we go to the next one, which is our project scope statement. And the things that are important in the project scope are the objectives. Remember, we said smart objectives actually help make sure that when we put this project back into the business, that we actually met objectives that are going to actually do what we expect from a business perspective. Then we have the scope description, which gives us a succinct description of the project, so we can very quickly understand what this project is about and easily be able to put it on documents and things. So, and also to help us get clear in our mind, it's almost like the description is almost like your vision for the project. And then we have the deliverables, the project deliverables. Normally in a project, in the scoping part of it, in your project statement, they're at a much higher level than they would be in anywhere else. The project requirements, the boundaries, product acceptance criteria. Here we expect to see some of your constraints and your assumptions. The initial project organization, the initial defined risks, fund limits, cost estimates, and project configuration management requirements. In other words, what has to be changed? If something changes in the project, how are you going to reconfigure both your documents and anything and equipment and things when you need to reconfigure the project or you change something in the project? What affects what depending on what you're doing? So that's your configuration management requirements. Then you've got your project specifications and approval requirements. So it's in some way your initial project statement should be a long way down to getting down to your project charter. You should actually have your project charter by the time that you finished, well documented by the time you finished with your planning part of the phase. Right, so planning, at the end of your plan, you should have a project charter. Now, you won't have you probably at estimating stage now, you probably wouldn't have a project charter yet. That's why some of these other things come into your project statement. And sometimes people call it a different one, a project initiation document, something that you're going to do like that. And some people call it a mandate. So your project statement could also be something like that. Then we said the most important input to this whole system is going to be, in fact, your work breakdown structure. And that's where your major, and that's why your project breakdown structure is something, let's put it this way. If we were drawing a project plan of the structure of the project, then your work breakdown structure your cost estimating is dependent upon your work breakdown structure. So your work breakdown structure is then a precedent of your cost estimating. So it's going to give us the main major deliverables. It's going to give us the sub projects and how they're going to be executed outside of the project team. There might be some outsourcing that you want. So you probably won't keep details of that, but somewhere you're going to have, if you outsource something, they're going to deliver something, so you're going to manage the deliverable on that one. And then you're going to manage the project phases. Remember, we looked at some phases when we did that project scoping. And really, it's a combination approach. You're going to look at this thing now from a holistic perspective. You're going to look at it from multiple perspectives. So that's the approach that we really have to look at. And now the details. Remember, we have this one. It's really, a dictionary is really like a database, isn't it? It's a database. It's going to have the statement of work. It's going to describe the work of each component. The organization responsible for completing that component. It's going to list all the schedule of milestones. It's going to have the contract information, quality requirements, technical references that assist the party with defining the performance of work. So it's really a lot of information about each of the activities that you actually have. So a work breakdown structure dictionary has got a lot of detailed information about the work breakdown structure. Then obviously your project management plan, which should be growing now. Should be growing. It's not complete yet, but it should be growing. So what will be in your project management plan? This is the first time you've seen some of the components, I would imagine, of what a project management plan would actually be compiled of. So it'll be the processes used to perform the project. Okay, there's tools and techniques. There's dependencies, there's methods of executing, methods for monitoring, methods to perform. There's methods of determining how these things are all done. Now, a lot of this is not something new. This really comes out of your organizational process assets. A lot of these things for doing these things are already defined in organizations. But that doesn't mean to say that they're all defined. And then you've got your project life cycle, your phases, if it's a multi-phase project, and the management reviews. Now, I know that a lot of you are going to say to me, hey, but that's a lot of work for a small project like we're doing, or small projects like we're doing. So I want to put you back to Stephen Hartley. And one of the things that I want you to actually look at in the scoping project, I actually ask you for some information there. You know what will really be helpful is if you try and define it for me in terms of how Stephen Hartley's actually defined, whether it's a light project or a medium project or a complex project. And I think if that was on page 48, was it? Yes, it's on page 48. Look at some of those characteristics of different projects. All right, and then you're going to see that there's a different amount of documentation that's required. But it also gives you some of the characteristics. For example, the budget forecasting. On a lean one, do you need to do budget forecasting? Probably not. But if it's greater than 50,000, then you probably are going to need it. All right? And if it's less than 50,000, you're probably also going to have some sort of budgeting cost. All right? So that's around about the mark that you would start looking at budget forecasting. All right? There's not going to be, even on a light project, there's not going to be a lot of contractual obligations, for example. So let's look at some of the other one. Are we going to do some other change controls? On a lean project, no. But what we want to do on a lean project is just take what you've got there. Right? However, remember on the diploma, this is what I want to do when it comes to assessment. Remember on the diploma, we have to be able to do, it's going to ask you in the training package to do complex projects. All right? It's going to ask you about complex projects. So you cannot take a project that's too light and use that on those when we're actually going to be looking at the assessment. I have to be able to give me evidence to show me about complex projects. Please just remember that. So although Stephen Hartley says, hey, on lean projects you don't need to do that, on light projects you don't need to do that, remember you have to show me that you can actually do complex projects. I hope that makes sense. All right, let me go on to the next one, and that's the final one. And now we're going to look at some of these techniques. All right, so we've looked at the inputs. Now we're going to look at some of these techniques. All right. Now, what is an Ageless estimating? All right, it's a top-down approach, estimating which involves the using of actual costs of a previous or a similar project. So it doesn't really make sense if you haven't done a project before. Will wants a definition of a complex project. Okay, let me answer Will, because it's a good question. All right, before I just carry on with these ones, let me give you quickly some of the characteristics of a complex project. All right, if you can just give me 1 second, I'll try and tell you what we mean by a complex project. All right, just 1 second. I actually do it in the assessments. Let me see if I can find an assessment here quickly. Just 1 second. Now, while I'm looking for this for you, a top-down approach is going to look at another one. Most sponsors or higher authorities are not. You're not going to get away with detailed planning with this tool or technique. But what you are going to get away with it is in the mandating phase. So if you're going to, let's say that you've done a road in one area and you can find a road that's very similar to the other ones, you can very quickly now take what those costs are, break it down, and actually fit those costs into the phases and the activities that you've already got on other ones. So that would be a top-down approach. It's not accurate, and project sponsors are probably not going to look at it. Now, let me just see. I think I've got one here. Let's see. No. Sorry to keep you. All right, that didn't work so much. So let me go back to Stephen Hartley, how he would. All right, first of all, in a complex project, you're going to have extensive planning. You're going to have to schedule time, at least on a monthly basis. You're going to have to budget and make a budget forecast. You're going to have to do a risk analysis. You're going to have multiple stakeholders that are involved, and you're going to have to manage those stakeholders. You will have a high impact on the business. The benefit measurement needs to be evaluated. There needs to be a formal evaluation, in other words. There will be contractual obligations, especially if there are outside people doing it. You would have to go out on a terms of reference, for example, if there's a service or some sort of quoting system if you're going on there, and there will be some sort of contract to deliver. So there will be that. You will have to do quality standards. You'll have to look at some of the quality standards. You're going to have to look at scope revisions. No ways you can run a complex project without being able to manage the scope revisions, and you're going to have to show how you manage them. It does mean that you're a full-time manager, a project manager. And then the other thing is methodology. It will be a complete methodology, and there will be a communication strategy even. All right, and then change controls need to be justified. Somehow they're going to be justified. Does that make sense about a complex project? If you can just raise your hand, then I know that we're still there, and we're on there. Then I'll continue with the. So we got Ian is right. Okay. Okay, we're there. All right. Okay, well, I hope it helped you there. Okay. Good. We're there then. Okay. All right. Now, I've described this one. I've said what you're going to do is you're going to look at a big project. You're going to give a quick estimate. When you're in the initiating stage of a project, this is where this tool comes into play. It's not likely that you're going to be able to use this kind of estimating technique to do the detailed planning. However, I'm pretty sure that there are that you will be able to get away with it on a light project, or even some of the others. Now, to determine cost rates, this is where a vendor might give you a whole list of published rates. So it might be a catalog, it might be for their service rates, it might be for material. So the resource cost rates will be there. The next one that we're going to look at is the bottom-up estimating. Bottom-up estimating is the most accurate of all of them. And it's what you're going to do in detailed planning. This is where you do the detailed planning. You go down to every the page that I got that on those ones is on page 48. Right, now let's look at some of these here. The bottom-up estimating is what you're going to do in your detailed planning, and it really goes down to each activity on your one, and it goes into detail in estimating the cost. All right, so that's where you're going to take your labor costs, and that's why you do your work breakdown structure to such fine detail. It's really for two things: to estimate your time and to estimate your labor. So you need to break it down so that's easy to do. The next one is obviously your parametric. Now that means a rate. Now that can be done fairly effectively, and you can often break down an activity so that it's easy to do with a rate. Now, I can give you an example of that. Let's say that you were going to put in or construct a telephone line, and there was going to be 800 telephones on this end of this telephone line, and you had to construct that. Now I can tell you now there will be tables about how much it's going to cost you, because often these things are already predefined. For example, the distance between manholes is already defined. The size of the cable is going to cost you per meter. So you're going to know if you do 100 meters, how much it's going to cost you. If you're going to do a kilometer, it's how much it's going to cost you. That's parametric estimating. All right. So when you do something so much per meter, it is fencing is another good example where you're going to get a parametric estimating. So wherever something is the same over and over and over again, you can use parametric estimating. Second one is fixed budget. Douglas has asked here, yes, bottom up does include materials. Absolutely, it does. Yep. Bottom up will include both your labor cost and your material cost. Fixed budget estimating takes the total amount of money that's available to the project and then divides it up across the project components. It divides it up across project components. All right, now this happens when you are not sure of a project, what the exact outcomes are going to be. In other words, how much it's done when you've got bigger phases to do, and you will only know the cost of something once you've done the first phase. So let's say that there are 3 dependent phases on doing this project, but you only know the cost of the second phase once you've done the first phase. So this is often used. Fixed estimating says, well, I've got so much money. I'm a venture capitalist, and I'm going to put this money into defining this business and or designing this business, and I want you to do it in phases. So the first phase, we know what we've done the detailed planning, but we really don't know the second phase. So we divide the project up. So that's a technique for dividing it up if we don't know what some phases are going to cost us. Now, the second one is often a vendor bid analysis. Now, that when you go out to tender and you come back with one, then you've got a very fine defined cost, haven't you? Because the vendor has already said, well, this is what it's going to cost us to do this. So if we're going to construct that and lay that cable that I was talking about, the vendor would have done very detailed cost and a bid for that one. Right? The only problem is that you better have defined the details of your activities well, because if a contractor puts in a bid, he's going to slice his prices to the lowest so you can get the bid. But let me tell you something, if you choose a vendor and you haven't got all the activities in there, the subsequent change control on that is going to blow your project out very, very quickly, because the vendor is going to ask an arm and a leg to do extras on it. Have you ever noticed that? I can tell you now that's definitely going to happen with a vendor when they do that, because they've come in with a very low price that they can just make money on it. So if you come to them and say to them, hey, but I wanted you to do this, well, you better believe it. Those contractors are going to really, really take you for an arm and a leg for that one. Now, the reserve analysis. There's two ways to do this, a reserve analysis. One is to put it into phases, or to put a reserve in a set of milestones. So that's called buffering, right? So some project managers like to say, take a milestone and put a reserve in that milestone, right? And other project managers like to have a contingency cost. In other words, they say to your project sponsor, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. When I've done my risk analysis and I look at the risk of this risk, there are some risks that have a high probability of coming off. I'm going to estimate and put aside and mitigate those risks by actually putting a contingency cost aside. So it's over the total project, whereas some project managers and some projects lend itself to actually doing it on a milestone basis. The more detail that you have, the better it is on a complex project. So in other words, if you can put it to a milestone and you can analyze the risk per milestone, it's probably going to be better than putting it over the whole project. So those are two ways that you can do reserve analysis. And the other one that you must never forget to take into consideration is actually the cost of quality. Okay, the total cost to produce the product or service needs to take the quality standards into consideration. So, and there's a whole cost to that quality. The quality control, the quality assurance of it, the testing of that. What happens if you get a whole lot of product coming off the line and it's not meeting specs, or the tolerances are too wide? Then you've got a problem on that. So you need to factor in the cost of quality. Yes, Roz is back and she says, is there a preference to have a separate contingency line item? And yes, often my experience is yes, that's exactly what they would. Yes, a separate line item is a good idea to do that. And I wouldn't build it into activities. I would rather have a separate line item, and it is often a preference, because then it can be managed separately. That's what I would say on that one. All right, so we've looked at quite a few techniques here for estimating, and so let's just have a quick look at some of the outputs for this one. All right, so there's activity cost estimating, and that is your quantitative amounts usually stated in monetary terms, the terms that reflect the costs of the project. Second one is all that supporting detail. Those are all the notes that go into it. All right, all your notes and your assumptions and everything that you've done, so that you can actually support the cost that you've actually done there. And then what are you going to do if you get a cost variance? How are you going to manage the variance in cost? All right, and this is refined as the project goes on. You're going to constantly refine how these things are. You actually find that the biggest risk is at the front end of your project. The biggest risk on cost is actually the front end of your cost, because as you do your iterations of your project, you can actually get better and better at managing that variance. Right, now let's go to the next thing. All right, we've done cost estimating. So let's look at some budgeting. How do we do this budgeting now? So I want to look at budgeting over the next few minutes. And the first one is, what are the inputs to this budgeting? So you say, well, I've estimated all my costs now. Now, what is a budget? Right? So what you're going to now do, you're only going to get your budget out of your detailed planning. You're very seldom going to have a budget within an initiation. And some of these tools are cost aggregation, the reserve analysis, parametric estimating, and some of the funding limit reconciliations. So this has got a lot to do with how am I going to manage that. Now here it comes out the outputs. What you want to get out of here is a cost baseline. Right? You want to be able to measure the cost baseline. So the budget is a guide. Somebody said it's a big stick. It's not a big stick. It's a guide to make sure that you're going to keep on track with your project cost. Right? The project funding requirements and the cost management plan updates, and how you're going to manage requested changes. Those requested changes will come in there. So what are the inputs now? Let's quickly go through those inputs. Whoops. I'm sorry, how did I get past some of those ones? I'm going to have to just go through them. There was a strange thing that happened there. Okay, there's a couple of slides that we're missing there. So let me just go through there. Your project scope statement is going to be critical for the inputs to this. Your work breakdown structure. Your activity cost estimates. All those estimates now that you've got are required for that, all right? And then your project schedule, because the project schedule is actually going to give you your cash flow. At the moment, you shouldn't have a cash flow, all right? And then your resource calendars are also going to help you with your cash flow. And then your contracts. Your contracts are going to say, well, when am I going to pay you out? At what milestones am I going to pay you out? And your cost management plan are those things that you put, the processes that you put in place to ensure that if something goes out of kilter, then variances can be looked at, that you're going to have some sort of control on it. Whether it's with an outside contractor or whether it's both internally. So let's look at some of these tools that we've actually got here. Okay. Cost aggregation is the process of tallying up the schedule of activity costs at the work package level and then totaling them up until you get to a higher level. All right, so now you're starting from the bottom, and this is why we call it bottom up. All right, so now you're going to aggregate until you get to the cost per milestone or cost per details. Now that's going to help you when you start looking at costs and variances. And you want to see quickly whether something is going out of kilter or not. All right. The next tool that we need to look at, whoops, something happened with this one as well. The reserve analysis. Okay, I want to just talk about the reserve analysis. Reserve analysis is you're going to take and look at all your risks and where the risks are, and in that one, and you're going to say, well, where am I going to put contingencies? Where am I going to put this reserve? Why am I going to have the reserve? So it's actually your justification for having a reserve cost. Remember, I said to some project managers, try and hide that reserve. In other words, they try and build it into the actual cost of doing something, and that's not a good idea. That's not a good idea at all. It's much better to actually have a reserve that's stipulated outside of that. And then your parametric estimating. So you're going to say, well, if I have got, you've won the contract to do tiling within a new hotel that's got 1,000 rooms, all right? Now your parametric estimating is going to say to you, well, it's going to cost me $1,000 per bathroom, and therefore I can do it 1,000 times over, all right? So that's parametric. So we've worked out one, and then there's another one. Now you can't just take it straight like that because it's going to get better and better, all right? You can't, if you just took it and you just did your parametric estimating and you said, well, this cost of $1,000 per bathroom is going to cost $1,000, and so therefore you've got 1,000. That's your project sponsor is going to question that because you should be able to get it better and better. In other words, your method, your labor costs are going to be reduced because you're going to be paying and it should reduce, all right, because there should be a learning curve, and you should be able to reduce those costs. That's where most of your thing in parametric is come, where you're going to save is in your labor costs. The other area that you're going to save in labor in your material costs is buying in bulk. So although a bathroom might cost you $1,000, when you buy for 1,000 rooms, you're obviously going to get a better price for that. And when you go out on tender for that, so you might say in the beginning of the project, you might say, well, it's cost us $1,000. By the time it's finished with the project, it should cost a lot less. Now, the funding limit reconciliation involves reconciling the amount of funds spent with the amount of funds spent with the amounts of funds budgeted for the project. Okay, so that's how we can limit where we're going to do them. So normally you would do this on milestones. So your funding limit reconciliation normally comes on milestones. All right, let's go to the next one. In cost budgeting, let's look at some of the outputs here. All right, the baseline. The baseline for costs is as important as it is for time. Right? And in fact, your baseline provides for a basis for measurement over time. So you see your time and your cost is going to come very, very close here. And this is going to give you your expected cash flow, right? Or funding disbursements. But this is often very, very critical for the chief financial officer, because he's going to have to make those funds available as you need it. So if you don't get this right, you're going to have a cash flow problem. All right. So your cash flow is as important for a CFO as it is asking for the total amount of for the budget. So cash flow is an important one. So that's your baseline. Your next output is actually your project funding requirements are the total amount of money spent on the project. All right. So they are determined from the cost of the baseline, and it may include a management contingency, which we've talked about, that's used to manage cost overruns. Okay, so this is where your funding requirements come in. That's when Roz asked me, should you have a separate contingency line? Yes, you are going to have a separate contingency line. All right, now what you're going to do is your cost management updates. Oh my. This is where you're going to get some of those charts that you see and your variance charts. But you're going to determine that in your planning and when you do your budgeting. So you're going to draw up those charts so that you can actually see what your budget is, and then you're going to put in your actuals and you can see what your variance is going to be. Right? You're also going to have a look at your requested changes. Right? So your requested changes. Now, the final one for this evening, and that's your cost control and your monitoring. Let's go and have a look at that. Right, let's look at our process again. Here are our inputs and our tools. What are the tools we're going to use? And then finally, what are the outputs on this one? All right, now, your first one, if you go through that one, I'm really having trouble tonight. Somehow this thing has gone, I don't know what's happened with this slideshow. I don't think it uploaded correctly. I have to check for the second share soon. Okay, your first one is your cost baseline. That's now your input to controlling your costs. And your project funding requirements, that's going to show you your cash flow and your performance reports. And you're going to get your approved change requests and your project management plan. So those are your inputs for that. All right. Some of your cost techniques now. All right, let's look at your cost change control system. Now, this is going to describe how you're allowed to make changes and the approval and delegation rights that you actually have. Right? There might be some delegation that you can actually just, if minor changes are made, the project manager might be able to do it. If there are major changes to be made, maybe it has to go before a project board or a higher authority. In other words, you've got to make a justification to take that change and the cost change. Right? So, but it needs to be tracked and closely linked to your change control system. Then the second one is your performance measurements. Now the technique, there is a technique for that one. So it's the technique that you're going to use is what they would often call the earned value technique, or EVT, right? Earned value technique. So what's the value of this project to the organization, right? And your EVT is continuously monitoring what you've planned, the value, what you've earned if you're getting an income from that project. But there's also a value in completing of things, all right? Because there will actually be one, and the actual costs expended to produce that work of the project. That's what you're going to look at when you're looking for variances. Result of that. So what you want is your earned value technique. So that's in the book, and I can't go into it much more than what I've done tonight. But if you want to bring it up in the question answer session, we can look at that one a little bit more in detail. All right. The second one is the go back. Is the forecasting. I really apologize for something's happened with my uploading tonight, and I've lost some of my slides in between here. All right, so forecasting is essential for projecting where you're going to be going, and that comes in. Although you've estimated for your project, when the actual techniques or your actual start coming in, you might start contracting or contracting the project by time. In other words, you get something done more quickly. All right? And if that's going to happen, if something gets done more quickly, obviously what you're going to do is that you're going to find that the budget is going to get slightly cheaper. Right? Because if you're getting things done more quickly, then you are probably going to save on labor costs. Right? If you start going over that, then by a certain amount, then you're going to say, well, I'm going over by 10%, so it's going to put and have an impact on your cash flow all the way through the project. That's why forecasting is important. Your project performance reviews are very, very important. And there are some techniques on that one as well. We can also look at those in more detail if you want to during a question and answer time. And the same with your variance management. Now, variance management is actually saying if there is a variance of so much, what must I do? I must stop and I'm going to do something with it. All right. So you're going to look at your variance. It's very much the same as change control. It has the same impact. So that's what we need to look at on there. Now, cost control. Let's look at earned value. Right. It is the measure of work to be completed, or in other words, the effort against the cost. All right. There's at a certain point in time. It's known as or could be known as budgeted cost of work performed. Okay, so it's effort over cost. So how much did this take? How much effort was put into this? How many man hours were put into this against how much it actually cost? Right, let's look at another one here. All right, we said earned value terminology, and then we're going to look at the thing. So here, planned value is often shortened to PV. It is the value according to the authorized project plan. So the one that your sponsor signed off, and you've said with that one, that is your planned value. Right? Your actual cost is the actual cost you've actually expended at a certain point of time. And the earned value is the value of completed work at that certain point of time. Right? There's a chart of it. All right, there's your actual cost. That's a little bit higher than your value, and in between there is your earned value. So if you've gone over budget by a certain amount, if you've gone over time by a certain amount, your earned value is that intersection of that. All right, so what you've planned, all right, and what you've earned is the difference. So there's your actual cost. All right, there's your time schedule, so your end value is there. So that's where it is. So here's where you go over budget or under budget, and here's where the time schedule. Okay, that's earned value. All right, now let's come back in funny order here. All right, we've talked about performance measurement and earned value technique, and we've said what those are. Let me go on to the next one. So you can calculate, if we go on to the right left-hand side there, we can calculate the cost variance, which is your CV, and it's your earned value minus your actual cost. So AC is your actual cost. All right? And schedule variance is actually your earned value minus your planned value. All right? So it means how far are you behind? Whereas the other one means the costs are higher. It means that your costs have gone higher. So if it's positive, it means that you're spending less than planned. If it's negative, it means that your costs are higher. And your schedule variance means that if it's in the negative, it means you are behind schedule. Okay. There's your forecasting. I've been a little bit through that one. I'm not going to spend too much more time on that one, but forecasting uses the information that you've gathered to dates. A calculation is performed, and they are based on work performance information. There are two types of forecasting techniques. Right, the first one is estimate to complete. It tells you how much it's going to cost to finish everything. So that's what you're going to, that's your one. And the other one is your estimate at completion. Now that estimates or forecast what you expect the total cost of work component to be. So that's all your scheduled activity or the project at its completion. Okay, I think that's where we've got to tonight. Whoa, I've got another one. Thing really went out of kilter, didn't it? I'm very, very sorry about this tonight. I'll have to try and fix it for the next one. Okay, examine your milestones. And you're going to look at the costs associated with their performance and the scheduled activities. Reviews take place at project meetings. This is where your project meetings, and what you're going to do is you're going to take them to your board. So your project board sometimes is put together where your sponsor or your client sits on the board as normally as a chairman, and then you have some stakeholders, and you have to go as a project manager, and you're going to say to them, this is where we are. This is how we've performed on this project. All right, so these are some of the things that you're going to do on that one. I am back green. I'm sorry about that. My last part of slides was totally out of kilter there. I don't know how that happened. I need to check that out, and I apologize for that tonight. Okay, I'm done now for the budgeting. What I will do for you is, because of this one out, I will actually put that, I will fix the slideshow up for you, and I will put it up on the web for you so that you can actually get it down. So I apologize for that. However, I will be available for the question and answering session. So if you'd like that, I can actually do. I will be available then later on for that, and hopefully I can get it fixed before the next session. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? Everybody's happy. Yep. Well, I just want you to remember, you don't have to rush this, and we can certainly look at it. I'm going to be running these sessions over and over again, and we'll probably run it 3 times in the duration of the year for next year, probably a few more. Doug, that's okay. The way that you're doing it now and you're communicating is fine. Okay. Now, I'm going to say goodnight to you then this evening. I'll see you at I will see you at the question and answer, and thank you very much for attending tonight. Good night then.